Welcome to this module in which we'll provide an overview in terms of data collection with specific emphasis on questionnaires. At the conclusion of this module, you should be able to identify the strengths and limitations of various methods in terms of constructing questionnaires. So when we're designing our questionnaire, we usually begin at least in the first aspect of its design, identifying what type of demographic data we're going to collect. By collecting the demographic data, we're then able to generalize the findings from this particular questionnaire to others that have been implemented across other populations. Once we've identified the type of demographic questions that we want to ask or collect, we want to give thought in terms of the rest of the questions and their positioning. So typically we start with fairly broad questions to begin with and then filter down to the specific questions of interest. This allows us to develop a bit of a narrative to the questionnaire, but it also provides participants with an opportunity to, feel comfortable in answering the questions, specifically if you're going to be asking somewhat sensitive questions towards the end of the questionnaire. In designing the questionnaire, you also want to give consideration in terms of whether or not there are other questionnaires that have been previously developed. If so, it will save you a lot of time in terms of designing the questionnaire, but particularly from a validation point of view, if other questionnaires have been designed and psychometrically validated, it just provides that a little bit more robustness to your data collection activities. We'll go on later in this module to briefly touch upon how questionnaires can be validated, but for the time being, we'll just leave it at that and just, to highlight the fact that if there are other questionnaires that can be used, please use those. Otherwise, you can modify them accordingly. The final thing to, think about when developing and implementing your questionnaire is the format of the questionnaire itself. So whether it will be a paper-based questionnaire or whether it be one that is conducted online. If it is a paper-based questionnaire, you're more than likely to implement it face-to-face with participants. That type of approach yields a very, very high response rate, very much more so than if the questionnaire is done online, which can be difficult in terms of getting response rates above 20%. The other, option is to recruit via online and then to send a paper copy if possible. Again, it's this sort of tangible approach of actually having something physically to complete, which funnily enough tends to yield higher response rates than asking people to complete questionnaires online. So the next couple of slides, we're going to focus on designing the questionnaire and what type of questions you can use. So for example, do we go with open or closed questions? Open questions obviously provide more detail and provide that qualitative aspect to your questionnaire. For example, what questions do you have about the surgery will provide greater detail than a closed question. For example, do you have any questions about your surgery? So a closed question typically results in a yes/no response, dichotomous response, yes/no, and it provides specific detail or I should say a specific response to your question. Moving on from open and closed questions, we can also, I guess, keep in mind the type of question and whether or not it will influence the response in any way. So two typical, I guess, things to look out for when designing your questions is whether or not it's a double-barreled question or a leading question. So double-barrel question, as the name suggests, has essentially a couple of questions nested within it. So something like, how useful did you find the post-care nurses and our online system? So the risk of creating double-barrel questions is obviously people typically tend to respond to the latter question in that double-barreled approach. So in that particular question, they may focus more so on answering the query about the online system rather than providing any useful information about the post-care nurses. Leading questions, as the name suggests, tend to encourage intentionally or otherwise participants to answer in a particular way. So if we take an example of this particular question, goes along the lines of, we've recently created these super clinics to ensure that every patient receives first-class medical treatment. What are your thoughts on this innovation? Obviously, this type of leading question, just by the way that it's worded, you know, the use of innovation and first-class medical treatment tends to imply that we're looking for a very much a positive answer. So we want to try and avoid as much as possible these types of double-barreled and leading questions, which can often make us feel like we're asking fairly boring or plain questions. But I guess this is the art in terms of balancing questions in terms of the questions being non-directional or I guess neutral in terms of getting a response from your participants. So in this slide we've got just a variety of I guess typical Likert scales that can be used excuse me, when constructing a questionnaire. Typically, the Likert scale is one that goes on a scale of, well, in this case, 1 to 5. So whether it be a numerical value with some sort of response on the top, or whether it be just a numerical value in itself. The typical 5-point Likert scale has variations on the theme of strongly agree, to neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. In this example, we've got it from not at all interested, not very interested, neutral, somewhat, and very. Like I said, typically we go with a 5-point Likert scale, but what we can sometimes find is that participants don't want to commit one way or another. So having this neutral option can handicap us to a certain extent in terms of getting a directional response one way or another. So rather than doing a 5-point Likert scale, there is the opportunity to do an even scale, so a 4-point Likert scale. So you'll notice with this particular example, we've got strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. So there's no option in terms of playing it safe and picking a neutral observation. Candidates or participants are forced to give an answer in one direction or another, either agreeing or disagreeing with the statement. What the 4-point Likert scale then allows us is to have levels of agreement or disagreement from that perspective. I guess the other thing to note is that scales typically don't have to be on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 4. Having larger scales, in this case a 1 to 7, provides an opportunity to discriminate between participants' answers. So having a 1 to 7 scale, or a 1 to 9, or a 1 to 19 or 20 scale often provides participants with the confidence to really give their true feelings on a result. So if for example this was a 1 to 5 Likert scale, you typically wouldn't get a lot of responses at the 5 or the 1 scale, but given the fact that it's a 1 to 7, participants are more likely to go with a 6 or 2 just because it provides that little bit of extra, I guess, distance from being at either extreme. Of course, there are different types of scales and Likert scales that we can use. Like I said, we can use the numerical scale. We can also use what we call semantic scales. So rather than putting a number on it and people thinking about, well, I'm giving it a 1 out of 5 or a 1 out of 7 or 1 out of 10 or whatever it may be, we replace it with words. So in this case, participants are asked to provide an outcome in terms of the level of pain. So whether the intervention was painful or painless, whether the condition was serious or mild, whether it was costly or inexpensive. And so again, it provides an opportunity for participants to tick the scale, and then once we've got the results, we can then convert that to a numerical response. So we can say, okay, well, this is a 1 on our scale, this is a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7. But from the participant's point of view, they obviously don't see it, so they're more likely to give an honest, I guess, answer without being influenced with any numbers that are associated with the response itself. So visual scales are just another extension. So again, rather than having numbers on the scale, we can have what we call a visual analog scale. So participants only see the two extremes, so no pain to worst pain ever, and then on that they're asked to mark where they're feeling. So marking it here, we could then translate it by superimposing a numerical scale on it and converting that marking to a numerical response. So here's just, I guess, a typical example of one of the more standard questionnaires that are out there. This is the SF36, which looks to measure a whole bunch of variables with respect to physical and mental health. So these are, I guess, the two components that are of interest, from which the questionnaire is broken then down into several subcategories. From these subcategories, there are various questions that deal with each. So again, when thinking about your questionnaire and how you want to design it, you can look at it from this point of view of it being, I guess, these are the two outcomes of interest. So rather than having only a couple of questions on physical health or a couple of questions on mental health, you can see that they can be broken down further, and you can make it as detailed or otherwise as you see fit. So a couple of tips in terms of designing the questionnaire itself. What we want to do firstly is identify, well, what is the purpose of the questionnaire? Is it to collect open data, specific data? Are we going to use open, closed questionnaires? What is it there for? Is it there to stand alone as its own data set, or will it feed into a larger data set? Secondly, we want to, I guess, obviously have questions that are relevant to the outcome of interest, but we also want to identify whether there are any other confounders that may influence our outcomes in any way. So by including questions on confounders, So, for example, we may be looking at physical exercise as our particular intervention, but including questions on whether or not participants have got any other physical ailments would identify whether or not those particular ailments may impact upon their ability to undertake the physical activity. So identifying those confounders can help us in identifying how successful or otherwise our particular intervention was. I guess as with any type of writing, we want to go through a couple of iterations of, in this case, the questionnaire itself. So how you draft the questions, how you phrase the questions may be understandable to some, but maybe not to other participants. So piloting those questions with a variety of potential people or potential participants will help in ensuring that the questions are clear and that the participants can understand what is being asked of them in that particular questionnaire. So rather than going out and surveying 100 people straight away, once we've got our questionnaire to a fairly good stage that we're happy with, it's always great to pilot the entire questionnaire. So piloting it, whether it be as a paper-based or an online format, will give you information about the recruitment. Piloting it will also give you information in terms of the usability, so how participants are interacting with the questionnaire, how they are interpreting the questions, but also giving you some practical aspects. So you may think that a 15-item questionnaire should only take 5 minutes to complete, but collecting data on how long it actually takes to complete, it may be that it takes 15 minutes to complete, in which case that may affect how you structure the questionnaire. Realizing that it takes longer to complete may influence how many questions you want to have in your questionnaire. From that piloting, we can obviously then refine our questionnaire and have it as our final version ready for implementation and dissemination. So the last couple of things that we just want to touch upon was two aspects relating to validity and reliability. So in the earlier slides I mentioned validity. So validity basically reflects how true are the questions that you're asking. So are they a true reflection of how people will answer them? So if we're asking questions about people's quality of life, are the questions actually reflected in that, that they are asking about social aspects, physical aspects, mental aspects, all these different constructs that make up quality of life. Reliability basically looks at the accuracy of the questionnaire itself. So if we were to give a participant the questionnaire and then 2 days later give them the same questionnaire, would we get the same results? So would the person in question be able to interpret the questions in the same way and give the same response? I guess these are the two most difficult things to overcome or to consider when creating your questionnaire. We want it to be valid, so we want it to be asking the questions that we really want to ask, and we also want it to be reliable. So the responses that we get from the participants are true reflections of their true responses. So there are a number of ways in which we can, look at reliability. So whether it be the test itself or from the perspective of who is administering that test. And they refer to two aspects called inter and intra-related reliability. So we'll discuss both of those in the next slide. So inter-related reliability, as the name suggests, is looking at if, I guess, more from an observation point of view. So if people or if the researchers are administering the tool and observing people, how reliable is the instrument or questionnaire in terms of getting consistent observations between the two researchers. So this is obviously interrelated reliability is more so from a researcher or an observer perspective rather than a participant's perspective. Test retest or intra-related reliability is looking at the questionnaire or the test itself. So as I previously mentioned, if we were to give the questionnaire to the same person a number of times, how likely are we to get the same test or same responses from the questionnaire or the test? The higher the test retest reliability or intra-related reliability, the better the questionnaire is, or the more confident that we can be that the questionnaire is actually providing us with true responses or being able to get the true response from the participant. The last thing that I just wanted to highlight, but we're not going to go into any depth really, because it's a topic that you'd spend a number of days investigating and talking about, is how we make our questionnaires valid. So there's a variety of ways from a psychometric perspective that we can determine whether or not our questionnaire is valid. So I'm going to give you a quick example from a behavior and attitudes questionnaire for healthy eating habits, or sorry, healthy habits that has been produced. So this can typically be done at the pilot phase, where in this case we've got over 10 questions that we're asking participants. And from that, we can run statistical models to see whether or not the questions are valid in giving a response around a general concept. So these are all of our questions. Again, won't go into the stats behind it, but there are certain statistics that you can do to identify how many general concepts are there. So very much similar to the SF36 that we previously showed, where we had physical health and mental health as the two main categories, and from that there was 4 subcategories from which we could link our questions to. This is a very much a similar illustration. So in this sense, we've got these factor loadings. So the factors that have got similar loadings we group together, in which case we look at these 4 questions. So the questions being, I usually decide my child's portion sizes, decide if my child is eating healthy foods, deciding or asking about what my child eats, let my children snack between meals. So they're asking, I guess, questions that have a similar theme. So we would then say that they are valid, and we would include them in the questionnaire. Moving on, we can see the next sort of batch of questions all have a similar loading as well. So I usually let my child watch TV between meals, serve meals at regular times, serve fruit and vegetables with meals, eat meals with my child. So it's all about the dining experience, I guess, for lack of a better term. And then we've got this the bottom cluster of questions. So encouraging my child to eat breakfast, a healthy diet, push my kids to play outside, talk about physical activity, join my child in outdoor activities. So it's all about healthy living, physical activity. So again, pulling these together. And what you notice is that they seem to sort of group themselves across these 3 factors. So hopefully that was just a bit of an insight in terms of reliability and validity. Again, we could spend a week or 2 weeks going into the intricacies of reliability and validity, but this was more so just to give you, I guess, a bit of an introduction and appreciation that questionnaire design can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to be.